Good afternoon. I'm Howard Marks, President of the Illinois State Society of Washington, D.C. The Society, for those that don't know, was founded in 1854 to foster and encourage social, friendly, and fraternal spirit amongst Illinoisans of the National Capital Area, now called the DMV, in a non-political, nonpartisan way, in the best interest of the nation and the state of Illinois. It is considered the oldest of the 55 state and territorial societies in Washington, D.C. We have many achievements, and I'd like to tell you just a few highlights here in about 30 seconds. We have an intern scholarship program that was initiated in 2002 to assist students from Illinois in offsetting the cost of summer internships in the offices of the Illinois delegation on Capitol Hill. The Society believes this opportunity should not just be for the wealthy. To raise money for the intern scholarship program, the Society holds presidential inaugural galas every 4 years. The first was in 1969. The gala is also very nonpartisan and attract thousands of attendees. We were a founding member of the National Conference of State Societies in 1909 and won several awards for our programs from this group. This week, we are celebrating the delayed Cherry Blossom Festival, underscoring the strong ties between the United States and Japan. Because of COVID, we have switched to a virtual platform this year. We have featured interviews with members of the Illinois congressional delegation, and more are planned, so stay tuned. In July, we are planning an outing to Nationals Park, where the Nationals will be hosting our own Chicago Cubs. Please join our organization in order to take advantage of this opportunity. In a moment, you will hear about our other programs. I now turn this program over to Dr. Rod Ross, who served as an archivist at the National Archives and Records Administration before his retirement. Dr. Ross.
Thank you, Howard Marks, and welcome to this webinar of the Illinois State Society, third in a series of 4 in response to the Chicago Commission that declared 41 city statues, including those to Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and John A. Logan, as problematic. Howard and I can have a mutual admiration society as I salute his leadership in molding the Illinois State Society into an organization of national significance dedicated to an appreciation of contributions of Illinois to American life. Yes, Illinois is the land of Lincoln, as our state license plates proclaim, but we're much more than that. I was muted, but I presumably am now not muted. The first of the Illinois-based webinars under Howard's presidency was one highlighting the role of the Springfield-based businessman, Julius Rosenwald, who turned the Sears and Roebuck department store chain into a gigantic early 20th century mail order operation, the Amazon of its day. With his subsequent wealth, Rosenwald chose to further educational opportunities for African Americans. In the chat, you'll soon see the link for the February 9th webinar that highlighted National Park Service plans to combine a Chicago anchor site with auxiliary locations in the South, where Rosenwald schools served African American children. Next up, in terms of historical-based Illinois State Society webinars, was a program on why we honor Lincoln. Then came a talk by Gary Eckelbarger on General John A. Logan, a presentation that C-SPAN will rebroadcast this Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, look in the chat, this time for the link for registering for the C-SPAN presentation. Our program today relates to Ulysses S. Grant, the man who gets high marks as the victorious general of the American Civil War. But Grant was more than simply a military figure and a talented writer. He was a two-term US president who served during a profound period of national transformation. When I was a kid, the Grant presidency was not considered a success, but the times they are a-changing. One who is partly responsible for that change is today's speaker, Charles W. Calhoun. Chuck, as I've come to know him, was until recently professor of history at Eastern Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. In retirement, Chuck and his wife Bonnie moved to Washington's Capitol Hill. Over the years, Chuck has made a name for himself as historian of political developments during the Gilded Age, the 40-year period lasting roughly from the late 1860s until the mid-1890s. Chuck's special concern relates to Republican policies regarding the South. Of particular relevance for today's presentation is Chuck's 2017 publication, The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. If you'd like to write out questions in Q&A, not in chat, please do so, but we'll hold them until after Chuck has completed his presentation. With that, I give you Charles W. Calhoun.
Thank you very much, Rod, and thank you, Howard. It's very much an honor for me to be here today to talk to the Illinois State Society. I didn't realize it was the oldest such society. I'm not from Illinois originally. I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, about 70 miles east of Chicago, but I've spent many happy hours in Illinois, including doing a lot of research in Chicago and Springfield, and a good bit of time in Galena, one of the homes of Ulysses S. Grant. Before we begin today, I would like to give you one caveat, and that is I'm not a military historian. As Rod indicated, I'm a political historian. I have no doubt that many of you watching and listening today know more about Grant's military career than I do. I haven't made that my specialty. As Rod indicated, I'm interested in the politics of the United States between roughly 1865 and 1900. And that, of course, was a period in which Ulysses S. Grant played, shall we say, an outsized role. And the topic today is Grant's presidency, a reappraisal. As many of you know, I'm sure all of you know really, in the last 20 years or so, we've had several biographies of Ulysses S. Grant appear. Most of those, I think, most of the authors of those biographies, I think, were drawn to Grant primarily by interest in his military career. And I think they do tend to treat Grant's presidential years as something of an inconsequential or maybe even incongruous sequel to his military service. In fact, not since the 1930s have we had full-length studies that focused on Grant's presidency. And indeed, there were only two such works in the 1930s. So I think it's needless to say that for a long time, we've needed a thorough reconsideration of Grant's 8 years in the White House. Those earlier works are clearly out of date and were certainly based on limited research. Much more has come to light since then. But several years ago, the University Press of Kansas, for which I've written several works over the years, asked me to write the volume on Grant for their American Presidency series. They have a series that has a volume devoted to each presidency. And I was honored by this invitation, but I also realized that this was going to be a formidable task. Most of the books in the Kansas series have tended to be syntheses, that is, bringing together what has been done before and appearing in secondary works. In Grant's case, The secondary works available were really not particularly helpful, I think, in examining his presidency. Those older books I mentioned and others tended to portray the Grant presidency in a highly negative light, presenting it as riddled with corruption and headed by a chief executive who, if not corrupt himself, was somehow inept and dealing with it or not dealing with it. In 1957, C. Van Woodward, the great American historian of the 20th century, wrote, Grant's presidency, he said, was America's sorriest administration. And that was typical of the interpretation over perhaps 80 or more years. But in the last couple of decades, we've seen efforts to, in a sense, rehabilitate Grant's presidential reputation, based largely on his efforts in behalf of African-American rights while he was in the White House. Indeed, some writers have come to regard Grant as a very good president, some even say a great president. So as I launched this project that Kansas asked me to do, it was clear I couldn't simply synthesize those two rather disparate approaches to his presidency, one very negative and the more modern ones seeing him from a different viewpoint. It seemed important to me then to go back to the original sources, the documentary evidence that Grant and his contemporaries produced. And that's always been my bent as an historian anyway. I always want to go to the primary sources in any case. And I will say that I spent about 5 years doing the research for this particular book. I think it's generally recognized that Grant's administration is one of the most controversial in all of American history. And I would add, one of the most encrusted with myth. So my aim with this project was not to engage in rehabilitation so much as clarification and, I hope, correction of some of the myths that we've seen over the years. My aim was to find out what was actually going on during Grant's 8 years in the White House. And the result is a fairly large book, largely because unpacking all of the controversies that characterized Grant's administration required a good bit of discussion in considerable detail. Now, as for myth, the overarching myth, as embodied in much of the historical writing and popular understanding of the Grant presidency, goes something like this. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president by a wide margin. He then took office on a wave of good feeling, but he soon began to make mistakes, and he thus drew criticism from reformers, who, because of Grant's mistakes, were justified in leveling opposition to his administration. Well, as is true often, nearly always with history, the truth is actually a little bit more complicated than that. What I want to first ask, really, is how did this overarching myth get established and so thoroughly ingrained in our understanding of Grant's role in the White House? How did this happen? What we have to remember, have to recognize, is that from the very beginning, Grant had enemies who denigrated his capacity for civilian leadership and actively worked for his failure. It didn't happen that he made mistakes and then he was criticized. Instead, from the very beginning, he had severe critics, some of whom opposed his idea of being president at all, and they opposed it even before he got started. First of all, who are these critics? First of all, there were partisan enemies. All presidents have partisan enemies, but it was really carried to quite an extraordinary degree in Grant's case, I think. And of course, what I'm talking about here is the Democratic Party. Grant, of course, was a Republican during his presidency. President Andrew Johnson and the Democrats disliked Grant before he became president. Their dislike really began while he was general-in-chief of the Army between 1865 and 1869. They didn't like the fact that General Grant was working more and more closely with the Republicans in Congress who were working against Andrew Johnson's failed Reconstruction policy and trying to replace it with one that was more effective. That hatred by Johnson and the Democratic Party persisted throughout his administration. You could see it in Democratic newspapers. Remember, newspapers at that time were highly partisan. You can see it in congressional investigations, particularly after 1874, when the Democrats won control of the National House of Representatives. They used the investigative arm very much against Grant. But I want to point out that Grant's political enemies, his political critics, were not only in the opposing political party, the Democrats, there were some even in his own Republican Party. And here what I'm talking about is what we might call a Northeastern elite. Many of the so-called best men of the country, they like to dub themselves that anyway. They were wealthy, highly educated, intellectuals, people like Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, and the Adams family from Massachusetts, E.L. Godkin, editor of The Nation, and others. These men thought that their type, that they ought to dominate the new administration that was coming in 1869. And these best men were angered and really unforgiving when Grant did not turn them to fill positions in his administration. Charles Sumner really is sui generis in all of this. Sumner, first of all, had very little respect for military men, of which Grant was, of course, a fine example. Sumner thought that the generals, the Civil War was won not by the generals in the field, but instead by the senators on Capitol Hill, of which he was one. Sumner may have wanted the 1868 presidential nomination from the Republicans. That's a little unclear. Didn't really have any chance of getting it. But it is much clearer, I think, that he did want to be Secretary of State in the new administration, and he failed to get that appointment. And he became an unrelenting critic, and he denounced virtually everything Grant did as president. Henry Adams was another that we need to take note of. He too craved an appointment, a young man, son of Charles Francis Adams, the former minister to Great Britain. He wanted an appointment, didn't get one. He at least wanted influence with the new administration to get appointments for his friends, didn't get influence either. So even before Grant took office, Adams predicted that Grant's administration would bring the reign of Western mediocrity to Washington. And of course, that would be ruled by people like folks from Illinois, as Grant was. Before Grant had had much time to do much of anything except deny Henry Adams a job. Magazine articles after his failure to get a position in the administration, he became a political journalist of sorts. And he devoted many of those articles to denouncing Grant and his administration. And there were other critics that we don't need to name. There were many of them we could talk about, but the point is also that Grant still remained popular in the country at large and had many defenders in the Republican Party, in Congress, and in the press. But in the early historical treatments of his presidency, those voices, those more or less pro-Grant voices, were largely ignored. After Grant left office, and even more so after his death, many of the men he had tangled with over the years, many of his implacable enemies, rushed to publish their version of events in articles and books. Over time, the most influential of those publications was Henry Adams's The Education of Henry Adams, published posthumously in 1918. In a sense, in the long-standing feud between Grant and the Adams family of Massachusetts, Henry, in his book, got in the last word. And let me share with you a couple of passages from Adams's book about what he has to say about this man, Grant. In The Education, Adams got in the last word. Grant's administration, Adams wrote, outraged every rule of ordinary decency. Grant was pre-intellectual, archaic and would have seemed so even to the cave dwellers. Accession to the nation's highest office by such a man made evolution ludicrous. The progress of evolution from President Washington to President Grant was alone evidence enough to upset Darwin. Indeed, said Adams, Grant had no right to exist. He should have been extinct for ages. And on, Henry Adams on Ulysses S. Grant. Again, as I say, some of Grant's contemporary allies defended him after his death, but their works were overwhelmed by the enemy's onslaught. So back to the creation of that overarching myth that I was talking about. When historians began to examine Grant's administration in the early 20th century, they paid much more attention to what his enemies had said than to what his defenders had said, or what Grant himself had said for that matter, or what Grant himself had done in the White House. But let me point this out. There was something more at work than simple intellectual laziness on the part of these early historians. Scholarly treatment of the Grant administration began in earnest during the era of Jim Crow, when the nation exhibited a broad acquiescence in the racial settlement that relegated Blacks to a perpetual position of legal and political inferiority. This was the era when the myth of the lost cause took root, and Confederate sympathizers began erecting all those monuments that are so controversial today. The historians' participation in this Jim Crow settlement, if you will, included a scathing indictment of the era of Reconstruction as a time when Southern whites were the victims oppressed by the federal government with the complicity of the formerly enslaved. In this narrative, Grant, the defender of civil rights, was portrayed as the oppressor in chief of the white South. It was said by these historians that he used troops and the heavy hand of the law to place ignorant Blacks in control over white people of intelligence and property in the South, and that he did so only for the base political purpose of keeping power in his own hands and in the hands of his own party. To discredit Grant all the more, the purveyors of this negative narrative gave credence to all sorts of allegations that Grant's contemporary enemies had earlier leveled against him. These historians in the early 20th century and afterwards, and others, accepted the stories that he was a drunkard. They accepted the stories that his administration was riddled with corruption. And they said that Grant was either involved in that corruption or that he was too incompetent to detect it and root it out. Many of the historians who wrote in this vein were, interestingly enough, in a sense, the intellectual descendants of the so-called reformers of Grant's time, the so-called best men, who favored rule by themselves rather than the likes of Grant of Illinois. The most influential of these historians was Allen Nevins, who taught at Columbia University. And his most important statement about the Grant administration came in his magisterial and huge biography of Grant's Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, published in 1936. It had the subtitle, The Inner History of the Grant Administration. Sort of dark and mysterious revelations would be coming from Nevins, supposedly. In this volume, Nevins portrayed the New York patrician, Fish, as the hero who saved the nation from Grant's malign influence. In keeping with the Jim Crow settlement of the time, Nevins argued that Grant's Southern Reconstruction policy was the worst portion of his record. And these are Nevins's words, for Grant's arbitrary acts in the South, Grant was far more worthy of impeachment than Andrew Johnson. Nevins's book won a Pulitzer Prize. So this kind of conclusion from a scholar supposedly sympathetic to the Grant administration demonstrated how deeply ingrained the racist interpretation of Reconstruction and Grant's role in it had become. This negative view would remain historical orthodoxy until the civil rights movement beginning in the 1950s and 60s. And after that, historians and others have increasingly stressed the nobility of Reconstruction and recognized the positive role Grant played in it in behalf of racial justice and political equality. Modern writers tend to see Grant as a hero of Reconstruction, not a villain. But even so, many of these modern writers, I think, have not known quite what to do with the rest of Grant's record in the White House. I think most have given little more than cursory attention to the rest of his agenda, sliding some of his most important actions and policies in the economy and in foreign affairs. So my aim in the book was to revisit the whole panoply of controversies that marked Grant's presidency, not only the matters of public policy, but the allegation of misdeeds as well. To me, it seemed clear that Grant's tenure in the White House deserved as close examination of the unfolding events of those 8 years as previous writers have devoted to the operational maneuvers and troop movements that marked his military career. Now, obviously today, in this short space of an hour, we don't have time for a detailed chronological account of the unfolding of the administration. So I'll just take a few moments to share with you some of the major issues. One of the most important observations to emerge from my research was that Grant confronted a vast array of problems from day one. Few presidents, I think, have been immediately thrust into so difficult a situation. Grant faced a wide variety of extremely complicated questions growing out of the Civil War and others besides. First was the great question of Reconstruction. This was enormously difficult. Grant's aim, as he put it, was to secure the results of the war. That's his phrase. But Andrew Johnson, his predecessor, had made a hash of it. And violence and turmoil were continuing when Grant became president. And so the problem was far from settled when Grant took office. Moreover, ancillary to the whole Reconstruction problem, Johnson's fight with Congress over Reconstruction represented a tremendous institutional struggle between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So Grant inherited a government that was almost dysfunctional when he took office, and he confronted the monumental task of trying to repair the relations between the branches and get things back on track. Another war-related problem related to the government's own finances. During the Civil War, Congress enacted a complex new governmental financial structure to meet the needs of the war. This included heavy taxes. Almost everything that moved was taxed by the Union government, a huge national debt, and even the emission of paper currency unbacked by gold, the so-called greenbacks. The problem now was, how do you adjust this wartime structure to peacetime needs? That was on Grant's plate. Again, Johnson had made a hash of that as well. Another war-related problem, the Alabama claims. I'm not talking here about the state of Alabama, but instead, this is a problem that related to the Confederate ship Alabama and other Confederate ships built in British shipyards and then armed elsewhere and used to attack Northern merchant vessels. Americans thought Britain owed compensation for the losses incurred by the Alabama and her sister ships in their attacks on Northern commercial vessels. Again, Johnson had failed to settle this problem with the British, and some feared that if it were not settled, then war might result. Another problem was the continued existence of the spoils system, and this was made more objectionable by the burgeoning growth of the federal bureaucracy in this period. There was a growing discomfort that more and more individuals were being appointed to offices, not on the basis of merit and their abilities and their preparation, but instead solely because of their political services. Efforts to reform the civil service had been attempted by Congress during the Johnson administration and they once again failed. And so there are many problems that were on Grant's plate as he became president. We could list many others, but we'll stop there and see how well he dealt with them. First of all, we should ask this question. What assets did Grant have? What assets did he bring to the job in tackling these problems? First of all, Grant was highly intelligent. He was not an intellectual, but he had a fine mind. He had an excellent memory, and he was a quick study. He grasped issues quickly. He had experience as an administrator. That was gained primarily during the war. In the Mexican War, he served in the quartermaster department. There he honed his organizational skills. And of course, during the Civil War, he had increasingly larger commands. And in those commands, at the end, of course, running all of the Union Army effort, he learned how to run a huge organization. He learned how to see the big picture. He learned how to delegate tasks to achieve his goals. Another attribute that I think Grant developed during the war was a very strong sense of determination, a drive to see matters to successful conclusion without being deflected. In his memoirs, many of you have probably read his memoirs, he speaks of never liking to retrace his steps, always moving forward toward his goal, developing alternative routes to get there if necessary. Grant also had a deep commitment to the nation's fundamental democratic ideals. This is another important asset that he brought to the office, a deep commitment to the nation's fundamental democratic ideals. Now, this may seem like an obvious attribute of anyone who attains the office of president, but recent history perhaps tells us otherwise. Before the war, Grant had been somewhat apolitical and highly skeptical about politics and politicians. But his service in a war fought for principles, followed by his battles with Johnson in the early years of Reconstruction, and his movement toward Congress in that period of Reconstruction, that early period of Reconstruction, spurred Grant's democratic commitment, including his support for Black suffrage. One other asset to take note of, Grant also demonstrated during the war that he was a good manager of men. He understood men's strengths and he understood their weaknesses. He chose able lieutenants during the war, men such as Sherman and Sheridan, McPherson, and others. How well he did on this during his administration is an open question. Grant himself would admit that some of his selections of subordinates turned out to be disappointments, and that some men betrayed his trust. Most notable, I think, among these was his private secretary, Orville Babcock, whose weasel-like behavior did much to besmirch Grant's reputation. But in looking at the Babcocks of the administration, I think historians have too often overlooked, and generally our understanding of the Grant administration has overlooked the many very good appointments that he made. Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State I mentioned a while ago, was an excellent choice, and many diplomatic historians regard Fish as one of the best, if not the best, Secretary of State of the 19th century. George Boutwell as Secretary of the Treasury, Amos Ackerman as Attorney General, Benjamin Bristow as Secretary of the Treasury. In doing my research, what the evidence made clear to me was that during the administration, it was the Republican Party, especially its leaders in Congress, that became Grant's new army, if you will. And his lieutenants, his Shermans, his Sheridans, his McPhersons now, were now the Republican Party leaders, especially in Congress. Men such as Oliver P. Morton of Indiana, Roscoe Conkling of New York, and John A. Logan of Illinois. All right, taken all together, these various attributes that I've mentioned represented, I think, important assets working in Grant's favor as president. What we have to remember is that between Appomattox and Inauguration Day, Ulysses S. Grant did not have a lobotomy. These leadership traits did not abandon Grant when he entered the White House, yet it took him some time to adapt them to his new situation. What about the other side of the ledger, the downside in his, what elements in his makeup perhaps didn't serve him well as president? I think this is the key one, his chief handicap, if you will, as politician and president, and that is his taciturnity, his very great reluctance to engage in public speaking. Grant was an excellent writer. He could deliver forceful messages to Congress on paper, of course, both special messages and annual messages. Public letters he wrote were highly effective, but he hated public speaking. And this grew out of, I think, his own innate modesty, his revulsion against self-puffery. He thought a person's deeds should speak for themselves, didn't believe in blowing his own horn. And indeed, he had been appalled by Andrew Johnson's rants, especially during the campaign of 1866, the congressional campaign of that year, when Johnson traveled around the country making what really were deplorable speeches to crowds in which he engaged in shouting matches with people in the audience. And Grant was on that trip and thought this was simply appalling. Now, as president, Grant did also do a lot of traveling. He was presented to crowds, but he would say virtually nothing beyond simply returning the greeting of the crowd and then turn the speaker's stand over to someone else. This is too bad because I think he missed an opportunity to use the public rostrum as a bully pulpit. And his reluctance to speak made it more difficult for him, I think, to control the political narrative. We talked today about controlling the narrative. And I think Grant not taking the rostrum inhibited his ability to do that. Moreover, sadly, his refusal to speak publicly could be taken by some, certainly his enemies, as a lack of knowledge or even stupidity. And you can bet that his detractors did all they could to portray Grant, the silent man, simply as a tool of party bosses ready to do their bidding. But I would submit that those party bosses were, in fact, not the masters of Grant, but instead his allies and indeed his lieutenants in furthering his efforts to achieve his agenda. In reality, Grant was very much a hands-on president, not only in Reconstruction, but also in foreign affairs, economic policy, and other domestic issues. Indeed, one of the chief complaints of his enemies was that he was too domineering as president. Grant proved to be a strong legislative leader. He issued pointed messages to Congress. He met frequently with members and senators, both in the White House and at Capitol Hill. Very many times he would hop in his carriage and come up here to Capitol Hill to confer with members on behalf of his pet legislative aims. He forged strategic bonds with key party leaders, and they served as his lieutenants in fighting for that agenda. So, given Grant's assets as a leader, we may ask, how well did he do? What are the achievements of the Grant administration? Again, we don't have time to go through them all, but let me mention a few, particularly bouncing off that list of problems I mentioned earlier. In Reconstruction area, he pushed for and secured ratification of the 15th Amendment, barring denial of the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. He used his legislative influence on behalf of a series of enforcement acts to uphold the 14th and 15th Amendments. He used troops on occasion to repress the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups, and his Justice Department, which, by the way, was created during Grant's administration. We had always had an Attorney General, but Attorney General's offices were organized under a more effective Justice Department in 1870 during Grant's first term. He used the Justice Department to bring members of the Ku Klux Klan to trial. In 1875, at Grant's urging, Congress passed a Civil Rights Act, and it was a Public Accommodations Act. It had a very modern ring to it. Grant had been pushing for legislation to protect African Americans' access to public accommodations. And this act in 1875, which he signed in March of 1875, outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, in inns, in public conveyances like railroads, theaters, other places of amusement, and in jury selection. And so it was an extraordinary piece of legislation, at least on paper. But unfortunately, Congress did not add much in the way of enforcement provisions. And in 1883, just 8 years later, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. At that time, of course, the Supreme Court was indeed a very conservative body. But we have to remember that Grant's efforts in behalf of civil rights and voting rights met increasing opposition, not only in the South, but from Northerners as well. And that was especially true after the Panic of 1873, an economic collapse in September of 1873, diverted people's attention away from troubles in the South and more toward their own economic difficulties. If Reconstruction failed then, it was largely because Grant confronted a nation, again, in the North as well as the South, that did not share his sense of justice and equality of political rights. But his efforts, I think, would later come to serve as an inspiration for defenders of civil rights to this day. What about the Alabama claims? Grant and Fish conducted negotiations with the British in the spring of 1871. They were conducted in Washington, D.C., resulting in the Treaty of Washington in May of 1871. That treaty created an arbitration tribunal that met in Geneva, Switzerland. The arbitrators in 1872 reached their decision and decided that Great Britain should pay the United States $15.5 million for the depredations incurred by the Alabama and the other Confederate commerce raiders. The Treaty of Washington also secured American fishing rights for Canadians, for American fishing rights in Canadian waters. It settled a northwestern boundary dispute between the United States and Canada, and many other minor provisions. The Treaty of Washington, we don't think much about the diplomatic history of the Grant administration, but the Treaty of Washington and subsequent arbitrations that grew out of it represented an important step in creating the rapprochement between the United States and Great Britain that, of course, eventuated in the alliance of the 20th century. On the economy, Grant largely succeeded in getting the federal government's own finances back on an even keel. Taxes were reduced. The national debt was cut by 17%, and the government still ran a budget surplus every one of Grant's 8 years in the White House. Grant also signed legislation after he had pushed Congress over and over again to resume the payment of gold for the greenbacks, the so-called Specie Resumption Act, and the nation went back on the gold standard. But it's true that not all was rosy in the wider economy. The Panic of 1873 was a major economic crisis. This was a banker's panic, if you will. It was largely the result of reckless private railroad investment that failed to pan out. The panic led to a deep, long-lasting depression. Economic thinking at the time was quite unsophisticated, especially with regard to what government could do to counteract such downturns. There was no Federal Reserve at that time. That's 40 years down the road. Grant toyed with the idea of spending on public works to put people back to work, but the conservative Republicans of the Congress would not go along with that. And Grant eventually and essentially bought into the current economic orthodoxy of the time that called for government restraint, both in fiscal and monetary policy. He rejected the idea of government-induced inflation. He vetoed a very popular bill to inflate the currency somewhat with extra greenbacks. Instead, what he did, following conservative economic orthodoxy, he said that the key to bringing back prosperity was to emphasize a stable money currency by which you could build business confidence. Businessmen would be more inclined to invest in for the future if they knew that the currency was going to be stable. On civil service reform, Grant worked through a commission that was authorized by the Congress. He promulgated rules. The commission developed rules for a merit system and competitive examinations for admission into the civil service. And Grant promulgated those rules in his first term to institute a merit system for the selection of federal workers. But the program met strong opposition in Congress. Congressmen and senators over the years had grown very used to the idea of using their recommendations for appointments in the executive branch to get their friends appointed to positions so that they could build their political machines based on their patronage power. And so Grant over and over again said, for this Civil Service Commission work to really be effective, we should make it permanent through legislation. And Grant and the Congress refused to do that. Ultimately, the Congress refused even to fund the Civil Service Commission anymore, and the experiment came to an end. But it's important to note that Grant still was the first president to institute civil service reform, and the plan he developed served as the model for the Pendleton Civil Service Act, passed in 1883, the origin of the modern merit system of federal hiring ever since. So on balance, Grant's scorecard was not perfect. It did include a fair number of significant achievements. And equally important, despite what his detractors said, his efforts, even when he failed, were generally in the right direction. So people often ask me, was Grant a good president or a bad president? These accomplishments that I've just gone through and others suggest that it is not unreasonable to regard Grant as a pretty good president, considering the obstacles that he faced. Certainly, his fellow citizens outside the vocal circle of his vehement critics were satisfied with his leadership, as indicated by his reelection in 1872. That year, Grant won reelection with 56% of the popular vote, the highest margin of popular vote for a presidential candidate between 1828 and 1896. And he got 81% of the electoral vote. Another interesting measure of Grant's effectiveness was a movement against a third term for him. Yes, I said that correctly, against a third term in 1876. About the middle of Grant's second term, critics began howling against the idea that he wanted a third term. They accused him of Caesarism. He wants to make himself Caesar. He wants to be military dictator for life. And they said this violates the two-term tradition. It's not in the Constitution at that time, of course. That doesn't come until the 20th century, but it's violated the two-term tradition that's set by Washington. But here's the point. The significance is not that Grant wanted a third term in 1876. In fact, he withdrew from consideration in 18. Rather far-fetched notion of a third term as a real possibility and a real threat. And that is why they resorted to the highfalutin rhetoric about preserving. After 4 years of his successor, Rutherford Hayes in the White House, substantial numbers of Republicans supported Grant for a third term in 1880. And he came very close to winning the nomination, which finally went to dark horse James A. Garfield. Interesting to note, in the convention in Chicago, Illinois, in 1880, Grant led on all 35 ballots that began the convention and before the move to Garfield on the 36th and final ballot. A large part of the argument for Grant in 1880 was that he would be a strong man in the White House after 4 years of what some referred to as Miss Nancy Jane Hayes, the weak Hayes. This particularly related to Hayes's easing away from the Republican Party's commitment to Blacks' rights. Many Republicans who thought that this question should remain central for their party favored bringing Grant back into power. So at least in the minds of his supporters in 1880, which included, quite vocally, John A. Logan of Illinois, Grant had established the notion that the president should be strong, he should have a strong voice and be an activist leader at the center of the national government. That he should not be a mere handmaiden of Congress, but instead a hands-on legislative leader. And that I think is an important step in the creation of the modern presidency. What some enemies denounced as Caesarism, Grant's advocates recognized as the appropriate role for the president in an increasingly complex society, which called for greater direction from the center. That, I think, was a central part, but often neglected part of the legacy that Grant left to future presidents. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Chuck. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I hope it came across. My picture it went away from the screen, and I didn't know whether I was talking to anyone at all, but I hope it worked out.
Yes, there were a couple of times where you froze, but it wasn't significant. So in the remaining 10 minutes or so, I have a question for you. Then we're going to call on Frank Scaturo, so he can speak directly his question, and then Howard, and then Gary Deverman, and I'll more than have enough questions to take care of the rest of the day. Okay. So first off, even though, let's talk about something that has absolutely nothing to do with the Grant presidency. Okay. When people say that it's problematic having a statue to Grant because he was a slave owner, how would you respond?
I would respond in a couple of ways, I guess. First of all, I think this whole statue business, I think you have to look at the circumstances that prevailed when those statues were erected and the purpose for which they were erected. And Grant's statue was erected to honor his service to the nation, saving the Union, winning the Civil War, and serving as president. Some of the Confederate statues, which I'm not going to discuss now, had quite another purpose in the erector's mind, I think. But secondly, Grant as a slaveholder is something of a misnomer. He very briefly, quote, owned an enslaved person that apparently was somehow went from his father-in-law's possession into his possession, whether by purchase or gift is a little unclear to me. But in any case, this was in the 1850s when Grant was in pretty bad shape economically. And what Grant did with that individual was to manumit him, that is, make him free. And what he could have done to shore up his own financial situation was to, he could have sold the person, if you will, but he didn't do it. He could have gotten as much as $1,000 for that individual, and he didn't do it. And that would have, $1,000 was very much money at that time, and Grant would have certainly shored up his own economic situation for himself and his family, but he didn't do it. And I think that's what we have to remember about Grant, the slaveholder.
Thank you. So it turns out that Q&A is not working. So if you do have questions, put them into chat. So right now I'd like to call on Frank Scaturo, who is one of the great Grant heroes of the late 20th and early 21st century America. Indeed. As a youngster, he spearheaded the movement to get the Grant tomb in New York City back to the condition it was in the 19th century. So Frank, take it away. And you're muted right now, Frank. And Michael, can you unmute Frank? Now, good.
Hello, Frank.
Hi there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chuck. How are you today?
I'm doing very well.
Great. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Doing well, thanks. I really appreciate your wonderful presentation and your exemplary scholarship in this area. My question is, Grant as president had in common with Lincoln a good number of political allies, typically ardent practitioners of the spoils system, as well as adversaries. Do you find that historians have been inconsistent in how they treat these relationships between the two presidencies? For example, are they more likely to commit guilt by association in Grant's case, while Lincoln in conventional narratives seems to rise above the frailties of allies around him?
That's a very good question. And I would never claim to be an expert on the Lincoln administration, but it seems to me that that when we talk about Lincoln and his use of the patronage and dealing with leaders in Congress, we say, my goodness, what an effective leader he was. He really knew how to corral his forces to get X, Y, and Z done. But the traditional story for Grant is, my goodness, you know, what he kowtowed to these people in Congress, and they were really running the show. And I think the truth is that Grant was much more like the Lincoln use of patronage than the typical story of Grant. Grant, if you read Grant, it's an interesting book that came out after Grant made his around the world tour in 1877 to 79. He was accompanied by a reporter from the New York Herald, a man named John Russell Young, who later became, by the way, Librarian of Congress. And the wonderful conversations that Young recorded, he actually sent them back to the New York Herald and then sort of compiled a huge 2-volume reportage of that trip. But one of the things he said is, Congress has its own view, and you have to be able to work with the Congress. And one of the ways you work with the Congress is through the use of the patronage power. Congress has its rights, the executive branch has its rights, and it doesn't really get you very far if you're at loggerheads all the time. You don't advance what you're for. I'm sort of paraphrasing now. You don't advance your agenda really if you're constantly at loggerheads, and if that means giving a senator the right to have a pretty big say-so and who's going to be collector of customs in Boston or wherever, then that's what you need to do in order to get things done. That this was the currency of the time, the currency of the realm, and I think that once again it's Grant's enemies, the so-called civil service reformers who painted this picture, and it was picked up by later historians. Grant, and I think it's in the Young book. Grant said something like the civil service reform basically means reform one guy out of the office and reform another guy into the office, the reformer's own candidates. Ari Hugenboom, the late Ari Hugenboom, who taught at Brooklyn College for many years, did a study of the spoils system in this era. And his basic conclusion was that the reformers were essentially politicians themselves, and they didn't really embrace reform until, gee whiz, they didn't get enough offices from President Grant.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you. Very good point.
So next up, and even though it's almost the bewitching hour of 3 o'clock Eastern time, unless anything self-destructs, we're going to keep on with Q&A for a while.
Fine.
So next up, we'll call on Gary Deverman to ask in question in person what he would like to ask you. So Gary is the immediate past president of the Illinois State Society, Howard's predecessor, and a key figure in the National Council of State Societies. Take it away, Gary.
Yes, can you hear me?
Can hear
Yes.
you, don't see
Oh,
you.
good, because it looked like they were canceling me out. But I have several comments and questions. But first of all, your presentation was exceptional and very uplifting, and it is really an indictment of our American education system that people do not know about Grant and a lot of the other political leaders that were so instrumental in getting so much done, particularly as it relates to civil rights. And all of this that's going on now, if people really knew all that went on before and all the efforts made to make things right, I think that would mitigate some of what's going on now. I guess my short question is, did you see the last 4 years as a reliving of the Grant years? Based on your comments, it seemed to fit perfectly.
Well, I'm not sure I would ever draw a parallel between Donald Trump and Ulysses S. Grant. Certainly, I think one parallel to be made is that there was an intense partisanship in the Grant years. And we certainly see that today, an intense partisanship, perhaps even interestingly enough, to greater excesses today than during the Grant years, although much of the legislation that did pass during Grant's administration was pretty much along party lines. There were a few things that got wider support, but by and large, the partisanship was very intense, and so it is today. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I don't regard myself as an expert on today's politics. You might say I take refuge in the Grant administration.
Well, you do talk about the media being basically a lot of the media being anti-Grant, what he was trying to do. And I think in part, he was such a strong leader. He totally turned the Civil War around, as you know, and I even have my Antietam hat here. And the importance of that battle I think he came in and turned things around relative to the conservativeness of McClellan and some of those, which was huge, as you know, as a historian, with the war and making that happen. It also resulted in Lincoln being elected because Lincoln needed a win to do that, and Grant provided that win. So I think you have said that is kind of at the cornerstone of why he was hated. Grant was hated because of the Democrats not wanting to have the Emancipation Proclamation.
Gary, I think I'm going to let Howard come on now,
right,
so that he can have a chance to ask the question that he is keen to answer about Grant's Indian policies. Howard, take it away.
Yeah, could you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. See if I can start. I can't start the video. That's okay. So the Chicago Monuments Commission, which is now reviewing some 41 statues on city property and Park District property. One of those statues that's under review is the Ulysses S. Grant statue. And in their write-up, they justify the review of the Grant statue because, and it's here in the chat, Grant's American Indian policies were well-intentioned, but ultimately disastrous. That's the reason why President Grant is in the box. That's why his statue is being reviewed. Could you please comment on that assertion, Mr. Calhoun?
Certainly. I'll say a few words about Grant's Indian policies. I think we should begin from the standpoint, launching the conversation, recognizing that Grant actually had a great deal of sympathy for Native Americans. And this wasn't something that he acquired in the White House. This was something that he acquired over decades, beginning really in the 1850s when he was stationed out west. And you could read letters that he wrote to his wife, Julia, commenting on differences, struggles between settlers and Indians, and saying that the Indians basically wouldn't harm anyone except their troubles were caused by the white man. And I don't think he ever really abandoned that belief. And I think that belief lay at the core of what he was trying to do in the White House with his Indian policy. When he became president, he appointed an Indian to be commissioner of the Indian Affairs. This was a first, Ely Parker. He created a board of commissioners, Indian commissioners, and their job was to oversee the activities of the Indian agents. Over the years, the federal government had appointed agents, and very often those agents went out to the so-called agencies and forts in the reservations in the West that were exploiting the Indians more than they were ever aiding them. And Grant wanted to bring that to an end. And one step toward that was the creation of this board of Indian commissioners. While he was waiting to be president, a group of Quakers met him and said, we really need to do something about getting other kinds of people other than the political hacks who've been sent out as Indian agents to serve the Indians in the West. And Grant agreed. Grant's original idea, this is not often pointed out, even by those who have examined Grant's Indian policy pretty closely, that he originally thought that Army officers might make the best agents because they had a stake in maintaining peace in their neighborhood, as it were, and seeing that the needs of the Indians were well served. But Congress, and by the way, Indian agents, I should point that out, was their appointments were part of the patronage business, and Congress very reluctantly would give up anything that came in their purview of recommending people to office. And so they eventually, Congress passed legislation banning Indian officers from serving in civilian kinds of positions. So they were no longer allowed to be Indian agents. That didn't last very long. And Grant then turned to other religious groups besides the small group of Quakers he had appointed to begin with. And his basic idea was we need to improve the funding, the delivery of supplies to the Indians, and their upgrade their living conditions and so forth. But the main problem was that, and by the way, Grant's Indian policies was known as his peace policy. The main problem was that the key to peace that Grant and his allies conceived was, in essence, to change the Indians' culture. That is, if you read his inaugural addresses, if you need his messages to Congress, you can see him over and over again. And if you read the transcript of his meeting with Indian leaders in Washington, you can see him saying, what we really want you to do is to become farmers and ranchers and essentially adopt white man's ways. We're going to Christianize you and this kind of thing. And as everyone knows, not all Indians were eager to buy into that basic transformation of their way of life. But this came, in essence, from Grant's wellspring of goodwill toward the Indians, not a sense of my way or the highway kind of thinking. He believed that this would actually inure to the Indians' benefit. And he wasn't alone in thinking this. This was the advanced thinking of the day. To our time, it seems, oh my goodness, this is a horrible cultural imperialism and destruction that is being advocated here. But in Grant's time, and I've always said that historical figures deserve to be judged by the standards of their own time. In Grant's time, this was advanced thinking. The so-called Friends of the Indian movement advanced this, that the best way for Indians to improve their lot in life was to give up the nomadic life, give up the communal life, and really become more like New England farmers, if you will, or Ohio farmers, or Illinois farmers. And as I said, not all Indians bought into that notion. And the wars were not all stamped out. As a result, fighting did continue. But I think that Grant's aim and one of his achievements, I think, was changing people's minds to some extent from, some of the people in the army who said, exterminate them, that's all we need to do. And that's the key to clearing up the Indian problem. Grant's idea was, no, we need to, again, a negative word in our context today, but in his time, civilize them, and
I think that
treat them as wards of the nation rather than as enemies of the nation.
brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. I'm so glad we got that question in. Much as I'd like to have us continue on and on, we will end no later than 3:12, 3 minutes from now. So among other things, I want to alert those who are here that the last in this 4-part series of webinars that basically are responding to the Chicago Commission judging statues will be Catherine Alman Jacob. We'll talk about memory and monuments. And I really, really like that point that you made, Chuck, about historical figures need to be considered within the context of their own time. as opposed to presentism for today. So in the last 2 minutes, do you have anything you would like to close with, Chuck?
Well, I guess I would close with the view that I hope that we're making some progress in correcting some of the impressions of Ulysses S. Grant. The last chapter of my book, it's sort of an epilogue, if you will, talks about how the negative image of him got established largely by his enemies, and there's a sense really in history and in other endeavors that stereotypes are true until they're proven otherwise, and then they're still true. We have these convenient notions, convenient ways of processing our understanding of the past. And it's very difficult to get beyond that. It's very difficult to leap over confirmation bias and bring people around to another way of looking at things. And again, back to my original point, that's why I went to all the original sources. I didn't trust what other people were saying about Grant, either the old versions or some of the new versions either. That I thought, I really can't do this until I.
Had we had time, I would have asked you about the difference between your book and Ron Chernow's, but we are out of time.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thank you all for being here. And so on behalf of the Illinois State Society, I bid you a good day.